Yeah, me.
Good morning if you're just joining us. We're expecting quite a few people this morning, so we'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to get in and get connected and set up.
Good morning then. Shall we make a start? It may be that some colleagues will still join us, but I'm conscious of the time and I know that we'll have an awful lot to pack in this hour this morning. So my name's Tracy Hill. Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to you on behalf of Joe and I and Charlotte, who you won't be able to see at the moment, on behalf of HPMA. It's another massive warm welcome to Sarah and to Nick from Delve, who are with us for this hour this morning. And I'm just going to leave it at that point and leave you in their very capable hands. So over to you. Thank you again.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tracy, and welcome everybody. I think there's a couple of people still just connecting, but we will make a start. We're really excited to be with you all today, talking about the difference between extroversion and introversion, really, and how we can stop talking and start listening a little bit more. So we're quite excited to share some of that with you. Has anyone been on one of our sessions with the HPMA before? If you have, you'll know it is quite interactive. We're not going to put anybody on the spot or ask anyone to speak up or anything, but we will be asking you to contribute on the chat. And we'll also be doing a couple of polls as well. And if you could just to start the conversation, really, it'd be brilliant if you could perhaps just start to type in chat, perhaps introduce yourself, who you are and where you're coming from this morning as well will be absolutely brilliant. I think most people are fairly used to Zoom. I know a lot of people tend to use Teams. So just a couple of things to note, really. You'll see in the top right, there's a view button. We tend to find gallery view is the most useful because you can see everybody's faces. If you want it on speaker view, you'll see the person that's speaking as well. And when we're sharing slides, you can have a play with the view buttons. You can't break it. Some people are finding the chat function, which is brilliant. So do have a look out for that and start to just introduce yourself on the chat. We have got options where you can raise your hands or put some emojis up if you feel like it. So there's some reactions on there as well. So that's just a little bit of a whistle stop tour. Obviously, you've got mute and stop video if you want to as well at the bottom. So if you need to step away for any reason, please feel free to do so. So what we'll do is we'll make a start. I'm just going to share my screen for a moment. Hopefully you'll all be able to see that okay. And if you haven't come across myself and Nick before, we're from Delve and we believe that work communities should be places where people can thrive. And today, as I said, we're going to consider the difference between introversion and extroversion and explore what this means in the workplace and some of the things that we can do to raise our awareness and take a bit more of an inclusive approach. We delivered a session fairly recently just around inclusive leadership. So there are some similarities between some of the things that we'll talk about today. But if you did get the opportunity to attend that session, you'll definitely be able to relate some of that to it. Just in terms of who we are as well, really, we both, myself and Nick, have previously worked in the NHS in senior HR and OD roles ourselves, to have that background and tend to do a lot of work with NHS colleagues in different parts of the country as well as with the HPMA. And some of the things that we do, it's very much around thinking about how we take a different approach to leadership, and we equip people with digital tools as well. So we'll share some of that learning with you today. I'm just going to stop sharing a second. Just really, one of the things that I wanted to explore with you was what does extroversion mean to you, and what does introversion mean to you as well? It'd be great to just get a little bit of info in the chat if we could. When you hear those terms, what does it mean to you, and what sort of things are you hearing? Okay, so we've got a couple of comments in there. Typically outgoing and quiet. Okay, so there's some of the differences there. Extrovert, sometimes someone who thrives around people. Where you get your energy from, and if any of you've done MBTI as well, you'll be familiar with some of those terms as well. So that helps. Extrovert, confident, happy to speak up, unafraid of opposing views, getting their energy from other people. Introverts getting their energy from alone time. So some different views on there. Again, different approaches to communication as well. And it is very much around where people get their energy from more than anything. So just to share my slides again, sorry, it won't be a second. Can you see that okay? So one of the things that we wanted to consider is the difference between introversion and extroversion, but also that impact that different styles can have on how we work together. And we'll discover some and share some practical ways that we can raise our awareness and take that more inclusive approach. Because we'll explore a little bit as how, so I'm an extrovert and Nick's an extrovert, and we'll share some stories around that. But we can sometimes subconsciously exclude introverts, and as introverts, we might not always be heard. So thinking about what we can do about that, and whatever our preference is, what are some of the practical approaches that we can take to raise our awareness a little bit. Nick, you're on mute.
Rookie mistake, that, wasn't it? How long have we been doing this?
I know. I thought you were just being introverted.
So just thinking about, the world in which we operate right now, and typically it is a world where extroverts are rewarded, and you are encouraged to come out of your shell and speak up in class from a young age. But the big thing for us all is how to ensure our work communities are places where both introverts and extroverts can thrive. So we're going to explore some of the micro cues that exist, which exclude introverts and devalue thinking and reflection, which are absolutely essential for creativity and innovation. And we think groupthink's overrated. There are small actions that you can take to collaborate more effectively and inclusively and really nurture the superpower, and it is a superpower, of introverts. So just to give you a bit of background, I've got two sons. They're now 17 and nearly 14. And my eldest son has a preference for introversion, and my youngest a preference for extroversion. And all the way through my eldest son's school life, all the feedback I've had is needs to contribute more in class, he needs to raise his hand, and it used to be tiring. I used to think, is there another way that you can really tap into his strengths and tap into his potential without having to be this person that's raising their hand all the time? And I remember him actually saying, when he was probably about 6, and he noticed something about the way him and his brother played, and he said, Mum, he said, I play on the inside of my head and Max plays on the outside of his head. And I thought that was really insightful for a 6-year-old to notice that already there's different preferences there in the way children play. So in a way, education by its nature favours the extrovert, because you're taking kids and you put them into a big classroom, which is automatically going to be a high stimulation environment. School ends up becoming this place where introverted kids learn how to get noticed and heard. They have to act like extroverts. So if you have introverted preferences, you may have been described as quiet or shy as a child, which is not necessarily the case. Our schools have been transformed by this new groupthink. So when you think about primary school classrooms, they're commonly arranged in pods of desks, better to foster that group learning. And even subjects like maths or creative writing are often taught as committee projects. So how did we get to this stage where extroverted traits are valued over introverted traits? And to some extent, it's in our cultural DNA. So when we think about Western society generally, it's based on Greco-Roman ideals of the person that can speak well, and it's like a rhetorical ideal. And we have always been, to some extent, a society that favours action over contemplation. But this really reached a pitch when we moved from, when you think about sort of agricultural society and then into the world of big business. And that's when it became the case to stand out and succeed in a company with people you've never met before. The quality of being very magnetic, very charismatic in a job interview suddenly became really important. And this happened at the turn of the 20th century. So it was somewhat coincidentally, somewhat not, accompanied by the rise of cinema and the idea of film stars. And so film stars became the ultimate guide on how to be magnetic and charismatic. And if you're a private person facing the question of how do I appear at this job interview, you go to the cinema on a Saturday afternoon and there's this film star showing you the way. So this became really quite deeply ingrained into our society. And when we think about the difference, how do gender and introversion mesh? In terms of statistics, it's pretty much 50-50. Men are likely to be more introverted than women are, but it's very, very slight. But the real difference, I think, is how it plays out and how it relates to cultural stereotypes. So for men, it can be a little more difficult because there are these cultural demands for men to be very dominant. But there are roles for introverted men too. So you can see on the screen there, the strong reserved man, the strong silent type. And I think especially in the UK, there's more of a place for dignified reserve than in the US. But for women, on the other hand, there's more permission to be more demure, more modest. So these stereotypes are starting to shift, but not fast enough.
Let's start by exploring what we mean when we're talking about extroversion and introversion. And thanks for your comments on the chat earlier. Has anyone done MBTI? Just raise your virtual hand if you've done it and familiar with it. So I think a few people are familiar with it. Getting a few raised hands there. Brilliant. So you'll probably have an awareness of your preference for extroversion and introversion anyway. So we'll just do a little bit of a recap or an introduction if you're not familiar with MBTI. But it's often a useful indicator of different personality traits and not just extroversion and introversion. So it reports on preferences in the way that we make decisions, the way we organise ourselves, how we get energised and process information, and helps to understand really and confirm our strengths and potential development areas as well. And appreciate and work more positively with difference. So if you have done it, it gives you that awareness. And it's obviously an indicator and it's not a test. It's not an excuse either, oh, well, my preference is this, so this is always how I behave. It just gives you a bit of an idea about where your preferences come from, really. And if you have an MBTI, you'll be familiar with the 16 different types, and you can go into any of these rooms whenever you like. But what MBTI aims to do is find the room where you kick off your shoes, do your favourite thing, and completely feel like yourself. You can just put your feet up and are really comfortable. If you think about MBTI, so the first preference pair is extroversion and introversion. And these terms were first coined by Carl Jung in the 1920s, and people with a preference for extroversion, as you've mentioned in the chat, get their energy from that outer environment of people and experiences and tend to focus their energy and attention outwards in their actions. And people with a preference for introversion get their energy from their inner environment of reflections and thoughts and tend to focus their energy inwards on reflection. So those are some of the differences, really. And there's no sort of absolute type or one or another. We can be somewhere along that spectrum, with some people may even having equal preferences and might be described as ambiverts, for example. So the challenge here is that if you've got 2 extroverts in a room and a couple of introverts in a room, who's spending the most time talking? Is everybody getting the voices heard, really? So it's about where you get your energy from. It's about some of the differences, really, you'll find are somebody with a preference for extroversion on the left there tend to act and speak first and think later. Somebody with preference for introversion will tend to think before acting or speaking, which is why it sometimes feels like you can't get your voice heard in a meeting, for example. So extroverts tend to prefer to get into the action. Let's get into it. I mean, myself as an extrovert, I know if I've got a problem or I want to, you know, something I'm working on, my first reaction is to pick up the phone or go and collaborate with somebody. It isn't always to think things through first. But I know when I do that, actually, I tend to make better decisions. And it's how I can value that time a little bit more and create that space for me to do that. So talking things through, very expressive when interactive. I mean, even on Zoom, I'm all over the place with my hands. You'll notice, because that's how I behave and how I work. People with a preference for introversion tend to think things through.
Could we just put someone on mute there, Tanya?
So I'll get Tanya to
Thank you.
Thank you. And gain that energy really from interaction, whereas somebody with preference for introversion, they tend to get that energy from real sort of concentration. So I know some people mentioned around that social confidence. It isn't always about that. It's not about sociability. It's not about social confidence. If you think about it in terms of a car, so somebody with preference for extroversion, they're out there getting their energy from talking to other people. So they're out there doing that, and that's where they get their energy from, and it keeps them going. It's almost like that solar power. Somebody with a preference for introversion, it's more battery powered. So they'll still be out there doing exactly the same things, but their energy is draining a little bit the more social interactions they're having. So they tend to want to come back and just plug in and recharge, and that's how they get their energy from. I just noticed a comment in the chat there around sometimes you can be extrovert in the workplace and in social settings, but introvert at home. And again, comes back to some of what Nick was talking about, really, around how, you know, sometimes we're sort of programmed for that extrovert world, and you have, even as an introvert, you've learned to adapt and behave in that way, because actually if you don't, you're sometimes not going to get that word in edgeways, really.
And I don't know whether, Sarah, just to interrupt there, sometimes Sarah and I always discuss this, because as extroverts, we crave that alone time, and I often just dream of carrying on up the M6 to the Lake District and going living in a little cottage for a week on my own. But the reality is I'd last a day before I needed some stimulation. So yeah. Actually, you know, sometimes we dream about the opposite, but actually in reality that wouldn't happen.
Definitely. And again, another comment in the chat there, being more introvert when I was younger, but actually more of an extrovert now. And that's an interesting one. I'm similar to that, Laura, because again, in school, everything that came back in my reports was Sarah needs to put her hand up more, Sarah doesn't speak up enough in class. And I do feel like going back to school and say, well, you know, I speak to people regularly, a lot of people now, and I'm not afraid to put my hand up. And, you know, so some of that is perhaps you sort of learn that and your preferences change. And it can be exhausting either way, really, whether you're an extrovert or an introvert. So it's really interesting. So what we'd like you to do, and I'll just stop there in a second. I'm hoping Joe is able to launch a poll for us, because I can't see where to launch them, Joe. But we've just got a poll that we'll put up on the screen that asks you to think about where you are, just so we can get a bit of a balance, really. And just have a look and see how many people identify as an extrovert and how many as an introvert. Is that sharing, Joe? Because I can't see it.
Not at the moment. Here we go.
There we
go. Brilliant. Thank you. If you're a bit in between, we haven't got a column for that, so you might have to commit to one or the other. Or if you don't want to do that, just put in the chat, I'm a bit of both. Again, I can't see the results coming in, Joe. So just if you have a look and see how many responses we're getting, and then let us know. If you can't see the poll, just
I can tell you it's introversion 71%, extroversion 29% at the minute.
Okay. We'll just give it a little bit longer to give you a chance to vote. Yeah, if you can't if you can't see the poll, just type in the chat if you feel comfortable sharing.
And I think it's important to remember, you know, when you are an ambivert, but like Sarah said, it's not about sociability. You wouldn't be able to tell in a social situation who's an introvert and an extrovert necessarily, but it's where your energy starts to drain. So I noticed, Ian, you'd put being an extrovert is exhausting, but actually it's not, because that's what the whole time you're out doing that, your energy levels are going up. So if you're perhaps leaning towards more introversion, you will find it exhausting doing that, and you might need to go back and recharge before you're able to do it again. So don't think about it in terms of sociability.
Yeah, and interesting, Geraldine, you've just shared there about an introvert by choice, but extrovert when I have to be. And we'll talk a little bit later, you know, we have developed coping mechanisms for this actually as an introvert and also as an extrovert. And it'll be interesting, another poll we'll ask you is how you feel about working from home versus working in the office, and what that's looked like for you sort of during the pandemic as well, really. Okay, so Joe has put some statistics in the chat there. So we've got 68% introversion and 32% extroversion. So probably about 2/3 of you identify more with the introvert preferences, and 1/3 around extroverts. That's useful to share. Thank you. Share my screen again.
Okay, so what do you think are, so if you've got more ease in a team and less eyes, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages? Anyone happy to just pop in chat? What do you see as some of the advantages and disadvantages of a type-alike team? Anyone happy to share? Yeah, probably immediate action. Yeah, a very loud meeting. Yeah, do you know, I actually, as an extroverted leader, when I was leading a team in the NHS, there was a couple of people with introversion preferences in my team, and I got the best piece of feedback I could possibly get, because she came to me and she just said, you know, Nikki, I never get a chance to say anything in the meetings. And I was a little bit flippant at that, and I was a bit like, well, everyone gets a chance to speak, what's wrong with you, you know, just speak up. And I had no empathy for it at all. But actually, after a really good chat, I realized that there was tweaks I could make, and we'll talk about a little bit about this later. There were tweaks I could make to make sure she's properly included in that meeting, and not assume that everyone's just going to speak up if they've got something to say. So brilliant in the chat there, absolutely. Too many years may mean that we don't think things through, so you might get that quick action, but that's also a disadvantage as well, isn't it? So brilliant. Preference to collaborate, lots of ideas being shared. Fantastic. What about the other way around? What does a type-alike, if you've got preference for introversion? And really funny, Sarah and I were running a session years ago, weren't we? We worked for an ambulance service, and the ambulance services were merging, and we had one senior team who all had a preference for introversion. I think there might have been one out of about 15 who had a preference for extroversion, and it was really interesting because we all had a team away day, and we went to the team away day and the meal in the evening, and in the meal everybody was just happy, just silent, eating the food. There may have been the odd conversation going on, but everybody was really comfortable in that space. And Sarah and I were going out of our minds. We were like, oh God, the silence, I can't cope with it. I need to fill in the gaps. We need to say something. But actually, she's really appreciating that everybody was really comfortable in that silent space and just reflecting on the day. So some brilliant comments in the chat there. So there obviously are advantages and disadvantages. And I thought we'd share a video. I don't know if you've seen this before. It's from the BBC, but it's basically just from somebody who's quite an extreme introvert, because some of you have talked about having a preference for both, but just from their perspective. It's only a couple of minutes, and I will just share my screen with you, and hopefully the sound will work. Bear with me. Sorry about this, everyone. Let me just see if I've got it. There it is. Right, let me just take it out there. This is where too many buttons. Right, try again. Just let me know if you can see that okay. And
I love it. And I'm not alone. Introverts are everywhere, and our quiet approach to life, our need for solitary time, isn't a flaw, it's a gift. But as an introvert, it's not always easy to realize how wonderful you are. The world feels like a place that rewards extroverts, where being loud is mistaken for being confident and happy, where everyone has something to say, but nobody listens. A world of open-plan offices, networking parties, and big personalities. For those who speak softly, it's easy to feel left out. As a child, I blended into the background. Many thought that I had little to say or that I simply didn't like others, but that wasn't true. People often think introverts are shy or antisocial, but these are misconceptions. Introverts, like anyone, can find socializing fun, but while parties leave extroverts energized, after some time, introverts need to recharge away from everyone. There's a scientific theory for this. There are two important chemicals found in all our brains: dopamine and acetylcholine. Dopamine is like a hit of energy when we take risks or meet new people, and it makes extroverts feel great. But introverts are more sensitive to dopamine and get quickly overstimulated. That's why we prefer the more slow burn feeling we get when our brains release acetylcholine. That happens when we concentrate, read, or focus our minds. It makes us introverts feel relaxed, alert, and content. But it barely registers with extroverts. Of course, like anything, it's a sliding scale. You can lean one way or another, or be a bit of both, known as an ambivert. Now I understand myself better. I am deeply grateful for how I am. Instead of filling up space with small talk, I listen patiently and make my words matter. I have few friends, but our connection is deep. I love spending time alone. It's where the chaos of a long day can finally settle. I can reflect and listen to my thoughts, and eventually reconnect with myself. Only after that am I ready to share with the world again. I've learned strategies for finding comfort in our noisy world, from using music to create bubbles of peace, to escaping to a quiet park at lunchtime. I adore the intensity and chaotic beauty of the world, but it's in quiet spaces where I feel truly at home. If introversion were more valued by society, it could make a massive difference to our collective future. The unique attributes of introverts really are a deep, quiet strength. And as Gandhi put it, in a gentle way, you can shake the world.
Okay, any thoughts on that? Anyone feel like, because when you think about what she's just said in the video, it is about energy. It's about where you get your energy from, and it's important that you think about how you recharge, what are the opportunities for you to recharge. And also we're going to come into looking at what our office environments are doing to us, and a majority of you have a preference for introversion. How are office environments and home working environments contributing to all of this? So that's something really important to think about. So if we just share the slides again, please do put your thoughts into chat at any point as we work through, and we will try and pick up on those.
Yeah, because what is interesting actually, because one of the things myself and Nick as extroverts, we have to train ourselves to count to 6 when we ask a question, particularly if you're in a group where you're wanting a response from people, because as an extrovert, I'm really uncomfortable with silences, whereas introverted colleagues who do a similar job to what we do are really comfortable with that, so they could sit and wait all day for somebody to answer, whereas I'm like, oh, nobody's answering, I'm going to answer for them.
Yeah, and that's true. Like I told you the story about my 2 sons earlier. I've had to really learn that if I go for a walk with my son, which is taking the dog for a walk, my eldest son, I used to just talk at him the whole time, ask him loads of questions, just fire questions. And obviously, as a mum as well, questions are quite naggy, aren't they? What are you doing about this? And I've had to really learn that he's okay with silence, and actually to walk in silence was quite lovely and a lovely thing to do. So you do have to adapt. You do have to learn how to connect with other people. But let's just think about, oh, sorry, that's our fire alarm. Hopefully you can't hear that, so it's gone now. So let's just think about how does this translate in the workplace? So if you think about famous introverts, J.K. Rowling, Bill Gates, Einstein, they didn't have to navigate the organizational bureaucracies for the bright ideas. To get their bright ideas. They could just operate it alone, independently. But obviously in large organizations, this can be a real challenge. Solitude is out of fashion. Now, it came back in with everybody working at home. And my husband works predominantly from home, and he's really, really struggling with it. But before then, solitude was definitely out of fashion. And we're starting to see some themes where everybody's now going, let's get everybody back in. And some of that hybrid and flexibility that existed is starting to very subtly dwindle away. So our companies, our schools, our culture are enthralled to an idea called the new groupthink, which holds that creativity and achievement come from this like gregarious place. So most of us now work in teams, in offices without walls, and managers who prize people skills above all. And lone geniuses are out of fashion. Collaboration is in. What does this actually mean for us? So when we think about what groupthink can look like in a team environment, and it's a phenomenon that occurs when a group of individuals reach a consensus without that critical reasoning or evaluation of the consequences or alternatives. So it's based on common desire not to upset the balance of a group of people. But this can hugely affect creativity and innovation. So think about how your best ideas come about. You may describe them as an epiphany or a light bulb moment, for example. A lot of mine, even though I'm an extrovert, come at 3 a.m. when I wake up. That solitude, that quiet, that reflective time is best for reflective thinking. And sometimes, to be fair, our best ideas do come from chance encounters. So you might have an important conversation and suddenly it gives you an idea of how to do things differently. And that's all well and good, but we take that too far and then we say, everybody should be out circulating, networking, having these conversations all day long. And we leave very little place for deep thought and for focus, and a workspace where you can't be interrupted. How many of you feel guilty actually putting into your diary, do not disturb, do not interrupt? I've got some time for thinking. I used to have to hide it in my diary. I used to have to pretend I was in a meeting, but actually I just used to give myself half an hour to just think something through, because I knew that wasn't my preference and I had to build it in, and it didn't come naturally. So it's how we really creating workspaces where both introverts and extroverts can really thrive. So we do need both. We need the chance encounters, but we do need the solitude, and we need to start respecting that. A recent study, literally, compared to our own study there, found that 48% of workers identified as introverts, and only 55% felt that their voice was heard by the CEO, compared to 63% of extroverts who said their voice was. So what we can do at work, what can we do at work to make sure we don't fall into these statistics, really? But it's worth saying, actually, that the human brain, you might have seen this in some of our other programs around inclusion or compassionate leadership, but the human brain has 2 different systems or ways of thinking. So the rational mind and the unconscious system. So when we talk about diversity and stopping that groupthink, we tend to speak to the rational mind, appealing to consciousness and the conscious thought processes. But it's actually the unconscious system, which drives about 90%, 99% of human behavior and decision making. So people will buy into rational arguments, but they won't necessarily change their behavior. So we all know, for example, I gave you an example of having somebody with introversion in my team, introverted preferences in my team. If that person had said to me, well, it doesn't work for me, I have to work in a different way, I'd have been like, oh, right, okay. But the elephant, if you like, that I'm trying to drive will just launch straight into a meeting that supports extroverted thinking. Does that make sense? So it's almost like going, you will agree with everything that's said to you, but if you imagine a man driving, or somebody trying to drive the elephant in a certain direction, that's what we're actually dealing with. So what really needs to happen is a fundamental redesign of our organizations, our decision-making processes, as well as how we facilitate meetings, and who has that power and the opportunity.
Yeah, so we'll talk about some of the things that we can do, but first of all, we just wanted to touch on some of the coping mechanisms, and we've talked about a couple of them now, and I know there's a couple of things in the chat that say, oh yeah, that's me, I definitely do that. But so Nick and I again did our own little bit of research into what introverts do to cope at work or cope in some of these environments, and it's interesting actually, because culturally we're often so dazzled by charisma that we overlook that quiet part of the creative process. And if you take Apple, for example, in the wake of Steve Jobs' death, we've seen a profusion of myths about that company's success. So most tend to focus on Steve Jobs' supernatural magnetism, and they tend to ignore the other crucial figure in Apple's creation, which you probably don't necessarily know, who was an introverted engineering wizard really, called Steve Wozniak, who toiled alone on a beloved invention. And if you look at how he got the work done, the sheer hard work of creating something from nothing, he did it alone, he did it late at night, he did it by himself, but you don't see that side of it. If you look at any organization, it's who are you not seeing? And it tends to be the people that are perhaps more introverted. So some of the things that we found, some people suggested that they sometimes, particularly in that open plan office, need noise cancelling headphones. We had a colleague, didn't we, Nick, who we worked with, who was introverted, and we'd be chatting about an idea because we're extroverts and we were loving it, and she'd like literally sit there with her fingers in her ears, and we'd be like, that's
How
really
rude.
rude. But it wasn't, it was just she needed to concentrate and listen, you know, to switch us off, because we were just talk all the time. So that was something that she did. We've talked about putting sort of those fake meetings in the calendar to create that solitude, and even as extroverts we probably need to do that a lot more. Might prefer to work from home more often, and like to retreat somewhere quiet. So these are some of the coping mechanisms. Interesting, I know Angela, you've just sort of put a question in there about, do you think more introverts have developed through home working, with having that more quality time to think and not being interrupted in the office perhaps? I know I can go off, I shared a book in the chat actually that I bought to try and understand my husband more, because he's introverted, and he was, through the pandemic, he worked from home and he absolutely loved it, because he hated going into the office. He hated all the bright lights, people just talking all the time, just annoying. I always said to him, you know, when you go and make a brew, do you make a brew for other? No, I just make it for myself. Like, I just don't want to speak to anybody else. And it was funny because again, during the pandemic, he was furloughed for a while, and they sent out a little survey, and I was like, oh, yeah, obviously given the nature of the role that I do, getting really excited about this engagement survey his company had sent out. And it was all things like, oh, you know, would you value a one-to-one with your manager at this time? He's like, no, can't think of anything worse. Like, I just want to stick pins in my eyes. Or, oh, let's do a quiz on a Friday, would you be interested? He's like, no, just leave me alone. But he worked so much better from home than he ever had in the office. And then they've been forced to go back into the office, and he's so much less productive. So it's an interesting question, really. Extroverts also have coping mechanisms. So particularly when I'm working from home, if I've got a day on my own in the office, I can't last that full day without speaking to somebody. So I'm more likely to pick up the phone or get Teams catch up in if I'm working from home for a long period of time, probably much to the annoyance of my introverted colleagues, but that's what I like to do. Tend to be more likely to want to work in the office as much as possible. Fill the diaries with collaborative opportunities. Oh, let's have a meeting about that. Let's brainstorm it. Let's think about what we can do together. And use meetings as an opportunity to voice their thoughts and ideas. So interestingly, just some different coping mechanisms there. So we've got another poll for you actually that we wanted to just quickly share. I'll just stop sharing the slides a minute, and if Joe could kindly share this one. Brilliant. So what do you prefer? Working from home mostly, working on site mostly, or an even balance of home and on site? Have a look. That's really interesting, Geraldine. Just picking up on the chat there around extrovert colleague struggles to work in an open plan office, whereas as an introvert, you can switch off to that background noise. And actually, for me as an extrovert, I probably do get more done if I'm on my own. When I'm in that office environment, I will spend a lot of time talking and probably not getting things done as much. So it's interesting, really. So we've got the poll results here. So we've got 43% working from home mostly, and again, that's interesting. Think about your preferences. We do have more people that have a preference for introversion here than extroversion. Only 11% saying working on site mostly, and then 46% is that even balance of home and on-site working. And have a think about when, obviously, you know, when you have been working from home, what has been the impact from you? Have you been able to embrace that? Please feel free to type in the chat as well. What's that experience been like for you? Has it been a positive experience?
I think, Sarah, I was just going to say, I think as well, what your organisation's now actually encouraging, sort of what's the culture is, are we getting that office creep back in as people start to, you know, as we start to get past that sort of danger zone of the pandemic, although it is on the increase again, but actually what is the organisation communicating around what the balance should be? Because I know some of the organisations we've worked with have sort of said we want people to start to come back into the office, but they've not described what that looks like or the impact of that, or why, you know, what sort of things are useful to do in the office, what sort of things are useful to do at home. So there needs to be a lot more guidance, and it's something worth reviewing from you're all sort of in HR, OD kind of fields. Really think about what the organisation is communicating around this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole other session around hybrid working as well, really, but just it's, if you think about that hybrid working approach, and actually if you're an introvert, from that less social interaction and more opportunities to have that autonomy, chances are you've probably enjoyed working remotely over the past couple of years. And on the other hand, if you're an extrovert, you might have found yourself less productive, a bit more irritable at home, struggling to recreate that external stimuli that you had in the office to motivate you. And you know, these are just typical. It doesn't, you know, as we've said, it doesn't mean just because you're an introvert you've enjoyed working from home. But these are just some of the typical responses that we've found. But some of the things that you can do, and think about yourself in your role, if you're working with people that are introverted, or yourself, if you've got some people that are now in the office and some are still at home, it's really important to ensure that introverts on your team aren't overshadowed, especially in team meetings. If introverts are interrupted during discussions by those loud personalities, they might not try to speak again. If it happens repeatedly, you can become quite disengaged. And I know a few people have commented on that, saying that's how they've felt. You can feel a little bit sidelined, especially if you're working remotely as well. So during any hybrid meetings, it becomes easy to overlook the virtual participants on the call and forget to include them in the conversation. When you're thinking about introverts, giving people that time and space, I mean, the good thing about Teams meeting is you have got your chat function and different ways to engage through polls and that kind of thing as well. So make the most of that, because even in a, you know, real life versus Teams meeting, you still get the extroverts that will speak the loudest. Your extroverts, give them airtime. So if you find that they're struggling to feel connected, try to set up regular face-to-face or video meetings with them so that they can talk things through with you directly. Use breakout groups on Teams and Zoom and things, and give people that airtime to talk about their ideas in smaller groups without dominating that team-wide meeting as well. And for extroverts back in the office, foster the return of the water cooler moments. You know, research shows that during that transition to remote working, those social relationship building activities are what people have missed the most. So it comes back to what's the purpose of people coming in the office? Is it that opportunity to collaborate? Or are people just sitting at the desk doing quiet work? If so, why do they need to be in the office? Help extroverts find those spontaneous moments of social connection during the day. And it's important to acknowledge that obviously, if you're an extrovert and you're not returning to the office, that can be really challenging. So what are some of the things that you can do to build in some team development events in a hybrid way as well? You know, even if it's just having lunch together over Teams, for example, that might be an introvert's absolute worst nightmare, but for an extrovert, they might really value that time. And encourage a range of communication styles. So to have that cohesive team. It's not forcing everyone to communicate in the exact same way. It's creating space for different communication styles so everyone can really have their authentic voice and trying different platforms that are available to it as well. And there's some things in there. I was just saying, Nick, have you been looking at the chat? Is there anything?
Yeah, there's just people saying, you know, that they've adapted. Right, some people have really struggled at first working from home, but there's many benefits as well, isn't there, about the travel? You know, so frustrating. You can see the traffic just increasing. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, absolutely. I think what we're trying to say is it depends. Really, to really shape your working day and your team around the type of tasks and activities that they have to do. So Lucy's talked about a hot desking space, so a number of the team get together to collaborate if needed, but actually, you know, your office is gone, hasn't it? So you're working from home, but it's just making sure, unlike my husband who just sits and hardly has any conversations with people, are we nurturing both the needs of those with introverted preferences and the needs of those with extroverted preferences? And it's really got to be about adapting and flexing. Yeah,
definitely. Thanks. And it's thinking about, you know, what are some of the things that you can do? If you think about how these play out in your workplace, how inclusive your practice is. And new ideas are often excluded because the human mind doesn't feel comfortable with the unfamiliar, and we recognise that knowledge that is familiar to us, we find it to be more valid. So people who look like others in the organisation or the community, because of the way that we've designed our organisations, we can tend to exclude rather than include. So it's that waste of human potential and ideas. So it's thinking about what are some of the things that you do in each of these areas, how inclusive are your practices around team meetings? You know, are there certain voices that you're potentially not hearing from, and how do you set that up? And some of you've talked about modifying your communication style as an introvert. You sometimes do have to push yourself to speak more than you feel like doing. And even if you're not the loudest voice or the most dominant voice, it doesn't necessarily matter. It's that conviction that carries the day. And the more you sort of practice that, it does help a little bit. But if we look at each of these in turn, so obviously with problem solving, it's always this experience where you in a room with your colleagues, that there might be some facilitator who's standing up there with a magic marker, just, you know, sticking loads of ideas up, and no one really does anything with them. And 40 years of research around brainstorming and problem solving has found that actually it repeatedly means that individuals that come together, you're in danger of that groupthink that we talked about earlier. So actually, when you found creativity to be the highest, people are working alone on ideas, and people that work in groups tend to sit back, let others do the work, potentially instinctively mimic other people's opinions, and then lose sight of what they believe in. So with problem solving, it's about understanding that people come up with better ideas on their own than in a group setting. If you think about your best ideas, sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and think that's a brilliant idea, or I'll be on a walk somewhere and I'll get some inspiration from it. So even though as an extrovert, I think by collaborating with others, I'm coming up with the best ideas, actually that's not always the case. Recognising those dangers of groupthink and peer pressure, and giving people that space to think, balanced with appropriate space to talk and share, is so important. And a team meeting, I mean, how many back-to-back meetings do you attend? And, you know, are they all adding value? That again, that's a whole other session, but it's worth thinking about the purpose of your meetings and the purpose of how you're coming together. And people come to meetings to collaborate, but you will find that power struggles emerge based on the hierarchical structures. You know, we know what it's like in the NHS. It is very hierarchical. So you tend to listen to the person that's the most senior in the room. You've got those power dynamics, which can be really, really difficult. So being clear on the meeting's purpose is really, really important. And not mistaking assertiveness for a good idea. Just because someone's shouting the loudest doesn't mean it's the best idea in the room. So tapping into the diversity in the room is really, really important, and building that psychological safety so that people do feel able to speak up. Seeking out opinions of others before the meeting, you might find it's more time consuming, but actually you're going to get much better quality decisions than if you're just relying on people in that meeting, and making that use of technology and virtual meetings as well can be really helpful. And thinking about workspaces, think about again, how are your workspaces set up? What are the rules around that hybrid split? How How are people coming back into the office? Why? Can you define what sort of work should happen in the office and what can be worked on at home? And if you're in the office, are there enough quiet times and spaces? We often find, you know, teams that sit and have the lunch together or encouraged to go on social events after work. If you don't want to do that, don't penalise people for it. Not everybody wants to do that. So it's really important to do that. And again, if you're an introverted manager, there's a pressure sometimes to have that open door policy. But again, work with your team to share that actually I need that a little bit of time to recharge and have that thinking time. There will be times when I want to collaborate and speak and I want you to share ideas, but sometimes I just need that recharge time, and just having that conversation with people can really help. So have a think about how are your workspaces set up, whether that's virtually in that Teams environment or in real life as well. Are there enough spaces to suit both that collaboration and that deep focus?
I'm just about to put a little link in the chat, which will take you to some of this, because this is just a summary of everything we've talked about. So if you do want to sort of have something to hand, that just to check in with yourself every now and then, how do we get big on inclusive workspaces, especially with that introversion or extroversion preference? It's all stuff Sarah's just said. So we'll just click through, but that is available to sort of take away if you want something to refer to in the future. So really it's just moving towards those final thoughts, really just to summarize where we've been, what we've talked about. You know, when we think about you know, what we know, that teamwork is great. It's a great thing to do for both introverts and extroverts. It's fun, it's stimulating, it's a great way of exchanging ideas and managing information and building trust, which is really, really important for that psychological safety and so on. But it's one thing to associate with a group in which, you know, each member works autonomously on their piece of the puzzle, and then it's another to be corralled into endless meetings or conference calls. So we just really need to think about what's the split within the day. I mean, think about leadership as well. Extroverted and introverted leaders excel in different ways, and they can learn from each other. So studies show that introverts are better at leading proactive employees because they listen to them and they let them run with their ideas. Meanwhile, extroverts are better at leading passive employees because they have a knack for motivation and inspiration. So while extroverted leaders could learn from their counterparts to take more of a careful approach to risk and let others speak up. So there's lots of sort of advantages and of both types of leader if we get in the workplace right and if we're setting it up for everyone to thrive. And you know, most humans, we have two contradictory impulses. We love and need one another, yet we crave that privacy and autonomy. So we really need to harness the energy that fuels both of these drives. We need to move beyond the groupthink, embrace a more nuanced approach to creativity and learning. And our workplaces should encourage that casual cafe-style interactions, but allow people to disappear into personalized, private spaces when they want to be alone. And we just thought we'd share this final quote. I don't know if anyone's come across Matt Haig before, but Matt Haig is absolutely amazing and he's done some amazing books. So if you're looking for a new read, this is a great one. It's called The Humans. And it's a quote, and it's basically about an alien who comes down to Earth with an intention of scoping it all out for his alien race to take over the whole of Earth. But he goes into a man's body and sees things from a very human perspective. And we always believe that leadership, if nothing else, all the different badges that are out there, you know, distributed leadership, this passionate leadership, all of it is about being human. And we just wanted to share that quote for you to take away, because everybody is unique and we really need to think about how we really sort of tap into that potential that Sarah mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and just finally, really, and you can take these away as well. You'll be able to access those in the link that Nick popped on. But just some really reflective questions for leaders to think about, and maybe share these with your, if you know, I know we've just seen a comment in the chat there around, think in terms of society favouring extroverts, lots of senior positions tend to be more extroverted. And actually, these are great questions, particularly if you're an extroverted leader. So just reflect on and think about, do it this week. You know, who in my team haven't heard from much this week? Do I need to be checking in a little bit more? What's being said that I'm not hearing? what is it that motivates people, and how can I give them more of this? Is it that creative space, or is it that need to collaborate? And often if you're not hearing from people, it might be because they're cracking on with things, but actually also they might need some support and aren't asking for it. So it's important to think about that. Am I creating enough space for fika time? I don't know if anyone's familiar with fika time. It's a Swedish term, and in Sweden they make that time for pastries and coffee, and that time to collaborate. So are you creating enough spaces for people to do that who need it? Do your team members know what their superpowers are? And are you tapping into them? Have you expressed that gratitude for them this week? When was the last time you asked for feedback? That's always a powerful one. We probably don't do it enough. How many times did I ask questions versus giving answers? And think about your one-to-ones. How much were you speaking and how much was your team member speaking? And is that ratio quite right? Also think about, are you being kind to yourself, depending on your preferences? What energizes you? What drains you? What are you not saying? Or what are you saying that's perhaps not being heard? So really important to think about. And some tips for some small team meetings are asking people to share a highlight or a new idea that they're excited about, and also a challenge. So making sure that people know you'll be asking this, so that they can prepare, but it gives you that opportunity really for people to share, not just, you know, the usual meeting where we're giving updates, but what's a highlight, what's a new idea, and what's a new challenge, a challenge that I'm focusing on in a minute. That can really help. So that's pretty much it from us, and it'd be useful if see how much time we've got left, 5 minutes left, if anybody wants to sort of type something in the chat in terms of an action that they'll take away, or something that's really made you think, and how you might do things a little bit differently, would be really great. I'll stop sharing now.
What are you going to take away? Even if it's just to put hiding time on your diary. That's a really good point. I feel a lot less selfish. You're not selfish. Absolutely.
More active speaking before meetings, definitely. It takes time, but it's so important.
And if you do research, Amelia, fika time, it's so interesting because it's all about the King of Sweden trying to ban coffee, because you thought that when people collaborated, try and overthrow him as a monarch. So it's quite an interesting story behind that, if you have a look into it.
I look forward to that then.
It is really interesting, but more opportunities for team members to contribute in their own way, rather than going, well, come on, let's speak up. I think that's a really, really key one.
Yeah, don't make the mistake I did. Well, everyone's got a chance. Just do it. You know, just really thinking about that before we make those mistakes. Yeah, brilliant. And do read Matt Haig, The Humans, if you get a chance as well, because it's absolutely just so thought-provoking and lovely. Just to see human behaviour from a different perspective.
Definitely. And that book, The Quiet Book, that I mentioned as well, is really good, particularly if you're an extrovert. But also I shared it with, I lent the book actually to an introverted colleague who works within the NHS, and she took it, she was going on holiday on her own and she took it with her, and she was like, this is just me, I've just read the book about me. It was amazing. So there's some good things in there. And it is about including everyone, as think about extrovert and introvert. We're not sort of bashing extroverts here at all, but it's about how you can create that space for everybody, really.
Brilliant.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. Tracy, is there anything you wanted to say just to finish off?
Well, I think I want to say a huge thank you once again for a dynamic, highly driven session from both you and Nick. So thanks to you both for that. And I think just a final conclusion from me, or reflection from me during this hour, is we talk an awful lot at the moment about inclusion. And how we behave in such a way that we support and encourage inclusivity. And I think that the time that we spent together this morning for this hour on this subject has just brought an added dimension into inclusion and behaving in a way that encourages the best from us all. So my thanks once again. Thank you to everybody who's joined as well. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Information regarding evaluations will come out to you very shortly, so please do respond and return that, and also let Joe and I know about any further sessions that you would like us to look at rearranging for you. All right then, well, thanks once more. Okay, and have a good day. Bye for now.
Bye everyone.
Bye everybody.